Good evening. Welcome to the first installment of 2014's Fall River History Lecture Series. Tonight we have Bob Kitchen, who's the director of the Fall River Historical Society, and history buff on circuses, I guess.
Yep.
Doing When the Circus Came to Town. It's a history of 19th and early 20th century traveling circuses that came to Fall River. Hope you enjoy the show.
Well, thank you very much for coming this evening and listening to my little presentation here. At the bottom of circus programs, you sometimes see, due to the nature of performing, the program may be altered. So we've had to alter a little bit here because due to the nature of using computers in a lecture, we have to work around some of the bugs. In any case, the circus, by the way, if we were to ask a child in the late 19th, early 20th century, what are the three big days in your life every year? It would be Christmas, your birthday, and the circus. Actually, for some people, talking to Mark a while ago and talking about how poor some people were, the birthday was nothing. All my father got on his birthday was a year older. They got no presents. Got a little bit at Christmas time. Circus was a big day, and yet I don't think my father ever saw a circus. He never had the admission fee. But there were lots of other things going on. The activity of setting up the tents, unloading the circus trains, going to the circus parade. All of this was free. And for poor children, it was quite a day. They would let schools out to see the circus parade, and it was the biggest day of the year. The circus is probably the oldest form of entertainment that we have, continuous form, that has a very large popular appeal. Okay, Richard. Now this is, they're going to play? This is the video. If not, we can skip it. Okay, the videos here, we're having some problem with the videos, so we're going to skip those. We'll go to the early beginnings of the circus. Where did the circus begin, really, the modern circus? It goes all the way back to England in the 1700s. Okay. And before we get to that, this slide's a little bit out of place, but what's rather interesting here, you'll notice the first thing talks about the circus tent being invented. Circus tent was invented in 1825. So before that, any kind of traveling show would either had to be done in some sort of a stable yard, or they would sidewall, put up canvas around. The canvas was simply too heavy to produce a very large, to hold up a large tent. I was reading a magazine article the other day about sails. And something struck me. The early sails on sailing ships were made of linen, which was very heavy. And when they invented cotton duck, a lighter material, the sails were lighter, easier to handle. I think the same thing happened in circuses, that the linen canvas was just simply too much to put up. And once they had a lighter material, they could now build circus tents. And that would allow shows to not only play in the daytime, play in the fair weather, but also in rainy weather. They could play in the evening and have lights. And so the shows were now able to travel a little bit more and lose fewer days. I'll come back to some of these other things in just a minute. Okay. The gentleman who's called the father of the modern circus is this gentleman here. His name is Philip Astley. Philip Astley was in the British Army. He was a cavalryman, a hussar. What he knew how to do was ride, and he knew horse flesh. And this was a time when everybody knew about horses and recognized good riding. Now, obviously, in this particular picture, Mr. Astley has gone beyond his riding days. He's rather portly, probably give the horse a ride in this particular case. But when he was young, he decided, got out of the Army, had no job, began to offer himself up as giving demonstrations of horseback riding along the banks of the Thames. His wife would go along. She would pass out some handouts, and then later on she would pass the hat. He noticed that not everybody paid. And so his next step was, Richard? Again, here is a silhouette of Mr. Ashley, and then there's some of the things he would do. Ride on one horse, stand on the back of 2 horses, 3 horses, stand on his head riding a horse, stand on his head, fire a gun. All of these things would be listed in the little handouts that his wife gave, and then he would then go out and produce these things. He finally built himself a circus, and you'll notice it's unlike the circuses that we would see today. There's no ring, never called a show a circus, but what he did was he put a fence up around what he was doing so the people who didn't pay couldn't see. And he would give his riding demonstrations. He was enormously successful, and eventually what he would do was to sort of package his show, take it to other cities in England, and finally bring it to Europe. And then when he got over to the continent, in France, for instance, he began to show in a round building. And what eventually happened here, because it was round, you had the circus ring come into existence. The ring exists only because there were horses in the circus. The circus was built on horses. Circus rings are universal if you have horses, 42 feet in diameter. And the reason for that is that the right amount of centripetal force is produced when you have a 42-foot ring. A horse can run at full tilt, and you can stand on the back of the horse and juggle or do whatever you want to do and maintain your balance. It's easier at that. Any bigger, then you just simply need a bigger building. Any smaller, it just doesn't work. And so Ashley had many imitators, and the first show was done in 1768, but the circus didn't come to America until much, much later, 25 years later, as a matter of fact. And the gentleman that brings this to America is this gentleman here. His name is John Bill Ricketts. This is a Gilbert Stuart painting, by the way, so he had to be fairly famous. You'll notice it's unfinished. Here's Ricketts, but you may also notice the horse over here, the horse in here, got his hand on the horse. Painting was never finished. This is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. His name is John Bill Ricketts. George Washington saw his show in Philadelphia on at least 2 occasions, and he and Washington would ride in the mornings, and they became friends. And so John Bill Ricketts gets credit for bringing the circus in America in 1793. So the first circus performance in America in Philadelphia in April of 1793. This building here we think is the second circus building, and of course you notice it is round, and it would have a 42-foot ring on the inside. Now Fall River wouldn't see a show like this for some time. Fall River was simply too small, also very unsophisticated. So Ricketts would take his circus to the bigger cities. Boston, he did come to Providence. He would rent a piece of land, hire some carpenters. They would cut trees, put poles up, nail boards to the poles, and create a temporary circus building. And Ricketts would then perform. And when he saw that business was dropping off, he just moved to another town, stopped paying on the lot, sold off the wood, and again moved on to the next town. Now, what's rather interesting is it took a while before the circus got to Fall River. Now, in 1803, Fall River was a town of 18 houses in the center of town. Bordens lived in 9 of the 18 houses. The rest of the residents lived in small farms scattered over the countryside, hardscrabble farms, by the way. Land here wasn't particularly good. And there were, in 1813, the first textile mill was built along the Quequechan. And from that point on, they began to build mills to take advantage of the water power that was there. Now, there were other entrepreneurs. Some were building mills, but down in Somers, New York, there were some entrepreneurs, and they decided that since these mill cities were growing, there were people there, they had a few cents in their pocket, and these were showmen, and they put together menageries. And then they would take these menageries out into the countryside. The first menagerie that I can find any evidence of is around 1833. It's called the National Menagerie. Fall River got to see 2 elephants. They were named Romeo and Juliet, a lion, a lioness, a tiger, a zebra, and a polar bear. Pretty big for Fall River in 1833. They would walk these animals in the middle of the night so that you couldn't see them for free. And probably they showed these, I think, probably in the stable yard of Blake's Exchange Hotel, which was on the corner of 2nd Street and Bedford Street, where the 2nd District Court is today. Later on, there was the gun house there, which might have been actually Blake's Exchange Hotel. And so they would exhibit in that particular stable yard. So that was 1833. The first circus shows up in Fall River 2 years later, and it's a combination menagerie and circus. Now, there was a lot of opposition to the circus from the Protestant clergy. They saw this as a waste of time and money. What did you get? You went to the circus, you spent your money, and what did you get from it? A little bit of fun. You're not supposed to have fun, and you just wasted your money. You could have used that money for something else or given it to the minister. So in any case, it was pretty much frowned upon. So the people who ran circuses realized that if you combine it with a menagerie, you see, how do the menageries survive? Well, you make some quotations from the Bible. Come and see the animals as mentioned in Holy Writ. How can you be wrong if you're referring to the Bible, you see? So the people went to see the animals that were mentioned in the Bible. And so that's how menageries survived, and it took a little bit longer for circuses to catch on. Okay, now, go ahead. This was probably a handbill that would have been used for a traveling show. This one has a single elephant. I don't know what a tiger cat's supposed to be. Is it a tiger or what? Looks like they might have had a monkey on the show and a Shetland pony. Not very much. But if you've never seen an elephant before, that's pretty unusual, okay? But once you've seen them once or even twice, after that it becomes sort of redundant, and you're not going to spend your quarters anymore to go see the elephant. Circus parades. Interesting letter we found in the Fall River Historical Society archives. It's on Tuttle and Milne stationery. This is just a copy, and it's dated June 15th, 1897. And it says, Miss Bertha Borden, Miss Josephine Baker, Miss Marjorie Hurley, Miss Nona Winwood, Miss Marion Tuttle, all good and obedient young misses. I hereby excuse from further attendance at school until the circus passes the corner of Bedford and Rock Street, even if it takes a week. Signed, Tuttle and Milne. Circus parades were again, a way that the circus used to advertise. When the circus was in town, you knew it. Now, I had brought a poster and I put it up, but it's behind the screen. There was a lot of posters posted. In a town like Fall River, later on in the late 19th, early 20th century, circuses would post a couple of thousand posters in store windows, and they would paste them onto fences and any place they could to advertise the circus. And if you didn't get the newspaper and you couldn't read, when you saw that poster, you knew the circus was coming, and you recognized the numbers as the date. And they would generally put these up about 2 weeks before the show came in. You can skip that one, yeah. Skip it. The smaller circuses, this would be a mud show. A mud show is a circus that travels over land. The early circuses that came to Fall River traveled not more than 20 miles a night. A typical jump would be from Warren, Rhode Island to Fall River, Massachusetts. From Fall River, Massachusetts to New Bedford. At the end of the evening show, the performers would get into carriages. They would be taken to the next town, where they would be put up in a hotel. The working men would take the tent down, load it. They would bring it to the next town, get in early the next morning, set the tent up, And then they would have a short parade through town to announce themselves as being there, okay? So you see this would be, but circus parades later on got to be enormous. The Ringling Brothers Bonham and Bailey Circus at their peak came to Fall River in 4 trains, 100 railroad cars, and 1,200 people. And they played a one-day stand and would move on to the next town. The steam calliope, Fall River gets to see its first steam calliope about 1850. So this show, by the way, did come to Fall River, and it did have the steam calliope, or steam piano. It was invented in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was always placed at the end of the parade. Why? Because it would scare everything. It would rattle the windows on buildings. And that was the whole idea. When the parade went by and the calliope went by, you knew that the circus was here. There was no doubt about it. And this one is being pulled by 40 horses. It didn't take 40 horses to pull the wagon, but people understood the skill it took for any man, and in one case, and for a woman, to handle 40 horses. Somebody had to sit behind them, and as they made a turn, pull the reins on one side and extend them on the other side so that they could make the turn. And I've seen this done on 2 occasions now, and it's pretty spectacular to watch somebody drive 40 horses. Okay. Recognize this? Granite block, right? Here's the granite block here. Look at the crowd. Now, what's rather interesting here, this is a parade. We thought this was probably in the late 1890s. But actually, it was much later than that, because George Petrin, who was a big railroad buff and trolley buff, noticed something. The trolley cars and the electric wires, which you don't see too well in this picture, but they're there. And the trolley didn't come to Fall River until 1913. So this could not be any earlier than 1913, nor could it be later than 1919. How do I know that? This is either Ringling Brothers or Bonham and Bailey. 1903, the Ringling Brothers bought out the Bonham and Bailey show. They kept them as 2 circuses until 1919. When they combined the shows in 1919, they stopped the parades. And every once in a while, I get somebody who tells me that they saw a parade in 1925 or 32. They may have seen a circus parade, but it wasn't the Ringling Brothers, Bonham and Bailey. They never paraded after that. The streets here are actually cobblestones. Once they started to macadam the streets, those very heavy steel wheels on those heavy wagons would dig right down into the asphalt, and so circus parades are no longer welcome anymore. And here's another shot, and again, look at the crowd. If you get to see it up close, what's rather interesting is all the men and boys are in the front, and the girls are in the back. Young girls and their mothers are in the back. There was always a fascination with circus people, right? They were sort of exotic. They were doing things you wanted to do, get away from Fall River or any place, and get out and live a little adventurously. At the same time, people were sort of afraid of them. They turn out to be just ordinary people who are trying to make a living, is what they're doing. The much later circus parade, 1920s, this is the Downey Brothers Circus. And this is way up South Main Street when they were using the Broadway lot. What I think is rather interesting, of course, was that all that big crowd watching the parade, great day for pickpockets. They were especially abundant when the Bonham and Bailey shows were around. And I don't think Bonham had anything to do with it. It's just the fact that he didn't really try hard to get rid of them. And they would follow the shows, and of course they would have a field day, the pickpockets. Ringling Brothers come along, they were called the Sunday School Circus, which meant they didn't tolerate much of anything. They would carry their own police force, and they would run people off the lot. There were circuses, by the way, that were called grift shows. And a grift show is a circus where they have a few other things going on as well. Playing the pea and the 3 walnut shells, okay? And the guy would do it very slowly, and you could always pick it out. And then once you put your dollar down or whatever it was, his hands moved so fast they were like lightning. He didn't cheat, but when you were done, you had no idea where it was, and the odds are 2 to 1, not in your favor. And so you had those sort of games going on. And on some shows, they actually paid the owners of the circus for that particular, it was called a privilege. And there were a few shows. A guy named Pogie O'Brien was one. He came to Fall River, and Pogie was a noted grifter. But it happens both ways. I had a lawyer tell me when he was a young lawyer working in the city in Fall River, circus was in town, and the powers that be sent him down to the circus and to get free tickets. And he came back with 100. And when he got back, they sent him back down. They said, we have more friends than that. Get another 300. And so they held the circus up for about 400 tickets at that particular time. So it works 2 ways. Okay. No. Here's a 40-horse hitch. This was not taken, by the way, in Fall River. This was taken in Brockton. And 40 horses, they're 4 across, 10 down. What's also, notice sen-sen. You know your age. Anyone know what sen-sen was? Remember, this is sen-sen gum. But remember those little packets of sen-sen? It was the strongest licorice you ever wanted to taste. And it was designed to hide alcoholic breath and bad breath of any sort. And they sold it in this little tiny packet. And when you were a kid, I remember buying them only because they lasted a long time. And you didn't have to, if you ate candy, you ate them too fast. These you didn't eat too fast. One of those little things lasted a long time. This is one of my favorite picture. This is probably taken in the 20s. But the Circus Parade coming up Main Street, here's the old City Hall down here. And this is a picture we found in at the Historical Society. Okay. These are a couple of some color slides that I have. And these came from a set that I bought a long time ago, but the color's deteriorating. But I just wanted to show you the color in these wagons. And these were designed for parade purposes, they enthrall people. And somebody in Fall River who hadn't seen very much, this was a big thing. This is all gold leaf. This one happens to be the John Smith, by the way, and Pocahontas is over here, and she's saving his life. And that was all, it was called a tableau wagon. Now these wagons, a good many of them are up at the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is where the old Ringling Brothers winter quarters used to be. This is probably the most magnificent wagon of all, and it's too bad the colors have faded. But again, look at the wood carvings here, the elephants. And this is a huge wagon, and this was a wagon that they would pull. You probably needed at least 20 horses to pull it. And they would often hook 40 horses to it. Okay. Now, P.T. Barnum was primarily a museum man. He made his money in museums, did not get into the circus business really until 1871. And when he finally got a good partner to he had a bad habit of combining with lending his name to the wrong people. Guys like Pogie O'Brien, for instance, who was a real grifter. And of course, what happens, it would soil Barnum's name. But Barnum was an interesting character, of course. He was a museum man. And so his shows began to show up with sideshows. And the sideshows probably you couldn't get away with today. But in those days, they would have a variety of different oddities or curiosities, as he would say. This gentleman's name is William Henry Johnson. He's also called Zip, the what is it? And that's how he was advertised. Today, he had mentally challenged young man. And of course, people would, in those days even, would say to Barnum, why are you doing this? Why are you showing this individual? And Barnum his response was, if he was at home, they'd lock him in a back room until he died. I give him work. I pay him every week. He traveled with Barnum until he died. And he was quite happy, actually, because he thought he owned the show. So that makes it even better, okay? And so William Henry Johnson, and again, you couldn't do this today in any ways. The Circus Sideshows eventually get down to Punch and Judy, giants, short people, little people, that sort of thing. People that it's a little bit easier to not make fun of, actually. This is Anna Swan, the Nova Scotian giantess, okay? She's a lovely lady who had a great disposition. And of course, here she is with this little person. And of course, circuses always exhibited the smallest person next to the biggest person. Okay, that made the smallest person smaller, the biggest person bigger. And sometimes they'd put if it were a gentleman, they'd put a hat on him, which would add another 8-10 inches to his height. Anna would eventually marry Martin Bates, who was also on the sideshow. He was a giant, and they went off and they became farmers in Indiana. If you go to Anna Swan's hometown in Nova Scotia and you get a letter canceled, the cancel on the stamp is Anna Swan. So rather kind of an interesting thing. Irene Woodward, the tattooed lady. Now, this was a fascination back in those days. You couldn't sell this today, right? I mean, you couldn't. You're going to sell this, okay? Bonham had a guy on his show called Captain Costantinus, who was a Greek. And he was tattooed on every inch of his body from the top of his head to his toes. And he traveled with Bonham for years and years and years. Really, what else was he going to do? He made a pretty good living. Now, what's kind of interesting is, as they say, the tattooed women were even rarer. But in any case, in this day and age, you don't have to. One time you had to pay a quarter and go into a tent to see this. Now you just have to go to the beach or the gym, or for that matter, the supermarket. I was in Montreal this past weekend and walking down the street, and this young lady came down, and sure enough, at every inch of both legs and arms and any part of her shoulders, she was tattooed. So again, tastes change, I guess, and what was spectacular isn't spectacular anymore. I thought you might be interested in some circus personalities, people who came to town. Now, Fall Riverites would be aware of these people because they would be in the newspapers and there would be stories that were circulated about them. This is Isaac van Amberg, who was a lion tamer, I guess you might say. And he came to Fall River first in 1846. Came with a menagerie. There were no tricks in his act. This was his act. Okay? And the question would be, would you do this? Okay? This is, again, a biblical reference. The lion lying down with the lamb. And the reason that and if Van Amberg left that group of animals, the lion would eat the lamb, okay? And essentially, the reason that they didn't eat the lamb is because they were afraid of Van Amberg. This was not any kind of positive reinforcement. This was simply just scared the animals, and they were simply wouldn't do anything wrong. But he would simply get into a cage. What's rather interesting is when Van Amberg went to London, Queen Victoria came to see him on at least 2 occasions. Once wasn't enough, she came back to see him perform a second time. And Van Amberg came to Fall River, I think, over 3 times. The last time in 1860, which was advertised as his farewell tour. And by this time, he must have been quite old. Tom Thumb was not a circus personality, but he was part of a traveling show. And what happened was P.T. Bonham realized that Tom Thumb, he heard a rumor of a little man, a little boy, who was just shy of 5 years old, who weighed just over 15 pounds. And so he went to see the young fellow, and he was impressed by how bright he was. And Bonham said, I can do something with him. And he convinced the parents, I think for about $3 a week, to let Bonham take the little boy and train him to be an entertainer. Once Bonham got him, he made him 11 years old. Now, if you think that a 5-year-old, 16-pound person is spectacular, make him 11, and that's even more spectacular, right? And so in any case, that's what he did. And what he would do is, Bonham taught him all sorts of things, and he would put on costumes, and he would perform, he would sing, he would dance. He was very bright, quick with it, and he once claimed that he kissed, I've got how many ladies? 1 million ladies or something or other, which probably did because the ladies couldn't really, everybody wanted to give him a hug because he was so small. But he finally gets married, and he marries Lavinia Warren from Middleborough, Massachusetts. Her house is still there, by the way, if you're going to see it. The windowsills are down there so that she could look out the windows. So he marries Lavinia Warren. The little fellow next to him, I forget his real name, but he was called Admiral Nutt. Okay, another Bonham. Bonham no longer was this Charlie Stratton. Charlie Stratton was his real name, becomes Tom Thumb. This becomes Admiral Nutt, who traveled around in a little carriage that was like a giant, it was shaped like a walnut shell. Admiral Nutt. And of course, he was in love with Lavinia too, but Lavinia she liked taller men. The little lady over here is Lavinia's sister, and she's considerably smaller than she is. Her name is Minnie Warren, and they were both small people. And they lived until, again, eventually, Tom Thumb passed away. Now, Tom Thumb came to Fall River first time in 1847, and he exhibited himself at the town hall. He came back 2 years later, again exhibiting himself at the town hall, and then he came back in 1851 in a show that was partially owned by Bonham, because Bonham needed money, he needed an attraction. Tom Thumb was an attraction. And the first time Tom Thumb came, in a city of probably 10,000 people, 1,500 people went to see Tom Thumb. That's how popular he was. People were starving for entertainment. And we keep thinking of people, how poor they were. But you know what? They still wanted to see things. And so they couldn't have all been, some of those people came, I'm sure, scratched. It was a real scratch to get the quarter to come back and see the show. Bonham ever being Bonham, first of all, he had a big wedding in New York City for Lavinia and Tom. And then finally, here we have Tom Thumb, we have Mrs. Tom Thumb, and we have a rent-a-baby here, okay? This was not their child. Bonham just simply went out and rented a kid someplace, paid somebody some money, and again, what they would do is when you went to see these, they all had these cartes de visites. Can't speak French that well. It's easier to say CDVs. CDVs is what they're called. And all of these attractions and sideshows and things would sell the cards, okay? So you could pick up a picture of these things. If you pick them up today, they're worth some money, by the way. So don't throw them away. In 1860, this fellow comes to Fall River. His name is John Adams, Grizzly Adams. Remember the TV show, Life and Times of Grizzly Adams? I watched that with my oldest boy every week. We're devoted fans of Grizzly Adams. Grizzly Adams was born in Massachusetts. He was always involved in nature. He had a way with animals. But in 1849, he gets the gold bug, and he goes to the gold fields. And like most of the people who went looking for gold, found nothing. So he goes off into the hills, and he becomes a mountain man. He comes across a she-bear one day with a couple of cubs. The bear attacks him. He kills the bear. He takes the cubs, and he trains them. And they were grizzly bears. Now, they just follow him around. You've seen that. There's a grizzly bear that they use on a lot of commercials. Well, it was pretty much the same thing. The bear, he was their mother or father or whatever you like to, in this particular case, because they knew that he took care of them. He also had a lot of other animals that he collected. And what he would do is, whenever he needed money, he'd come down to like San Francisco, he'd hire a storefront, and he'd exhibit the animals. And so one day he got into a wrestling match with one of the bears, and the bear stove in his skull, about the size of a silver dollar. And then later on, one of the monkeys that he had bit him on that area, and it became infected. And when he went to see the doctor said, I think maybe you better go home, essentially saying that, you know, this may be the end. So he packs up all of his goods, goes around Cape Horn, comes back up to New York City, goes to visit P.T. Barnum, going to sell him his show. Guess he said, I like to sell you these things. Barnum says, I already own it. He said, what do you mean you already own it? He said, well, you sold it to another guy, and I bought it from him. And so he was rather confused at the whole thing, but Barnum says, I'll make you a deal. We're going to put together a show in 1860 for the summer, and I want to get you some fairly decent acts. We're going to go out, you're going to exhibit your bears, and if you last the whole season, I'll give you $500. And so off they go, and they show up in the spring in Fall River. They have their little circus parade, and by the way, there's a black bear and a brown bear in one cage. They get into a fight. The brown bear kills the black bear. And they hung the bear's carcass in Colonel Durfee's barn. And so everybody went up to see the bear carcass in Colonel Durfee's barn. And of course, he did perform. The next day, the show went to New Bedford, which is about, a 15-mile walk. Got to New Bedford. Barnum shows up to take a look at at Adams, and he says, Adams not doing too well. He said, look, I'll give you half the money if you quit now. Adams said, no, I'm going to last the whole season, and he did. And again, Adams wasn't all that old. He was still a relatively young man. And of course, he does finish the season. He does get his money. And I just wanted to show you this. This is John Adams, or Grizzly Adams' grave in Charlton, Massachusetts. And it's sort of a case of what not to do. First of all, Barnum goes to visit the grave, and there's no stone. So Barnum has this stone actually made. It's got a little poem about the great hunter and such. And then later on, and you can see 1976, the Charlton Historical Society puts this stone. When you walk into the cemetery, it does everything but light up. So there's the grave over here. You don't have to look too far. It's sort of like going to see Lizzie Borden's grave, and they painted arrows on the road, which is true, by the way. I'm not joking in that case. But in any case, they go to see, probably not the thing to do in any case. But we go up the Eastern States with it, and I got my daughter and my son, and I make them stop on the way back. And I have a picture, which I didn't want to include here, of them standing by the gravestone. And you can see neither one of them saying, what are we doing here? Well, why did my father bring me to a graveyard and take my picture standing next to this stone? But I do have the picture, but I decided I wouldn't show it. One of the acts on the show, one of my favorite people, Ella Zoyara. Ella was a great equestrian. She could do things that only a man can do. And the reason for that was she was a man. Ella started the show, and when you read the trade papers, what happened was, especially in America, all the Judies, if you like, would show up at the show, and she would perform, and then what they would do is throw bouquets into the ring, which she would pick up with a great deal of flair. Of course, once she was exposed by the New York Clipper, which was the trade magazine, all these people just disappeared into the woodwork. Well, the same thing happened when she went to Europe, except in Europe, they don't take things so lightly, and literally had to escape with their life, because some of the people who were that she had fooled were not really, didn't think it was too funny, to be honest with you. What's rather interesting is Johann Strauss Jr. was so taken with her that he writes in 1855, the Miss Ella polka. His publisher, however, knows that Miss Ella is really Mr. Ella, And so what he does is he just changes the name to the Ella Polka. And so that, Johann never did figure out that it was actually a man. Here we see him in 1863. So this is 3 years after. And later on, after he had been exposed, he would perform as Ella Zoyara and then perform as Signor Zoyara. So he played the male and female parts. He had a family, married an equestrian named Sally Stickney, and he died in India traveling with a circus troupe, and that's where he is buried. What's rather interesting is the gentleman who actually created him was a man named Stokes, had a circus. There was another circus down the street. How come that guy's doing more business than I'm doing? Simply because he realizes the guy's got a female, a young lady who is riding on horses while he's got a male. So he said, what I need is a female who can ride like a male, and literally created this gentleman. Simply let his hair grow long, kept him with women all the time. He had all of the mannerisms of a woman, and had a successful career. And at one point, there were actually 3 different Ella Zoyaras, because there was nothing in the circus business. If a fellow named Dan Rice, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, he had his own Ella Zoyara. So nobody knew who the real one was, because they all made up their own because they saw it as an attraction. Adam Forepaugh. Adam Forepaugh was the biggest competitor of the Bonham and Bailey Circus. And you notice he has a pretty good sense of who he is. He's a giant among the pygmies, okay? And who are the pygmies? Well, there's P.T. Bonham, there's James Bailey. These are the Sells brothers, his 3 biggest competitors. And so he was a Philadelphia butcher, by the way. And the next picture, you'll see him sitting here. Here he is in the middle, Philadelphia butcher. And his big thing was he just always wanted to have the better show. When he came to Fall River, he got good reviews. He came in 1867 the first time. He got a good review for his show. In 1863, he comes back, and his show has got these, they would put on these big specs. All of the big circuses put these big specs on. This one was called Lalla Rookh's departure from Delhi. She was supposedly going off to her marriage. And they had the elephants with the howdahs on the back. And they dress everybody up, including the working men. They had costumes for them, and so they would parade around the tent. And this was, you notice, by the way, $200,000 is his Oriental pageant. You got to watch when you look at circus advertising. They do exaggerate a bit. Now, he might have spent $100,000, but who knows, right? So he made it $200,000. It sounds better. And what he did was he had a beauty contest. The most beautiful woman in America was going to play Lalla Rookh. And so there really wasn't a contest. What he does is he hires Louise Montaigne, who's an actress. And she's the $10,000 beauty. Really paid her, you notice it says here, a salary of $10,000. Paid her $100 a week is what he paid her. She did at one point decide that if she was supposed to get $10,000, she'd get it. And Forepaugh's response was to hire one of the showgirls for $15 a week and replace her. From a distance, you couldn't tell the difference anyway. On Bonham Circus, 1872, I like to show this picture here. It's rather interesting. This is Victorian times. How do they get away with these costumes? Rather interesting. We could sit here for 2 days and talk about this. It's a whole different subject. I always used to say, well, they had clowns for the kids, and for the gentlemen, they showed ladies' legs, which they seldom, you didn't see on the street, that's for sure, and you didn't even see at the beach in those days. Linda Gill came to Fall River with the Bonham show. As I said several times, the Bonham and Bailey Circus came to Fall River just about every other year. They would change the show every 2 years. And this, of course, was 1879. The show was here in 1879, so Linda Gill was with the show. And of course, there were the spectacular act, Zazzle, the human cannonball. Do you know they still have, I think I've seen at least 50 human cannonballs in my lifetime. It's not an unusual act. I've seen it twice this year already, and you always get somebody ready to take the job of being fired out of a cannon into a net. Why, I don't know. It's not that they make a lot of money, but in any case, you're in show business, I guess. Interesting gentleman. What's he doing that nobody else is doing? Smiling. You ever see a picture with people smiling? His name is Dan Rice. He's the guy who ended up with, he also had a Zoyara on his show. It wasn't the real one, but it didn't make any difference because nobody who came to the show knew the difference anyway. Dan Rice was a clown. Something interesting, before the Civil War, the circus was a one-ring show. They were talking clowns. They sang the popular songs, they told jokes, sometimes on the ribald side. It was not a show, for the most part, for children. The afternoon show would be for children and ladies. The evening show was mostly for men. And it was primarily because of the jokes that they told. Very political, by the way. Dan gets stuck behind, the Civil War breaks out, and he's in the South. And he begins to work his way north. And when he finally gets across into Union territory, everybody knows he's played in the South. Well, he kept playing. He had to eat. And so he kept playing while he was in the South. But almost every place he went, they had what circus folks called a clem, which is a fight. There was always somebody looking to fight with the circus folks. He had so many fights. Normally, in the daily book that the circus kept, the diary, what they normally would do is, if they had a clem, they'd put it in. He had so many fights, he only recorded the days that he didn't have one. Okay, so he had a tough go of it. He shows up in Fall River in 1863. And Dan Rice, and again, for a while, one of his costumes was a top hat, striped pants. He had white whiskers in his old age. He looked like Uncle Sam. And for many years, people thought it was Uncle Sam, but I think they've finally given somebody else the credit for being Uncle Sam. And again, you see, he's the Shakespearean clown. He's the Shakespearean clown. And again, as I said, after the Civil War, the circus becomes primarily, it's for adults, but it's gone are the talking clowns. Nobody had the voice to talk to 10,000, 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 people in a tent with 3 rings. Okay, so we went from a 1-ring show to a 3-ring show, and what happens to clowning? It's all mime now. So you don't have to hear what they're saying. And here's a circus songster. They would sell these during the show. You could go home and all the songs that the clown sang, they were there. He also, on the next page, you'll find there are some jokes. Now, Stephanie decided we should put these in. If you look at very carefully, some of them are very innocuous. Some of them are actually a little bit suggestive, okay, and some of the jokes that they have here. In any case, so you could go home and you could be funny too. Okay. About 3 months ago, I'm reading a new article about a lady named Rose Wentworth. She's the only lady Somerset lady turning somersaults, or Somersets as they would call them. And it says she was born in Fall River, Massachusetts. The only problem is Wentworth is her married name. And I can't find her maiden name anywhere. And I've looked everywhere. I've looked to try to find. She eventually married a clown named Harry Wentworth. Now, what's rather interesting is that Rose, supposedly born in 1865, shows up in London in 1873. And she's in a production of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And I actually went online, I found the cast, I found one Rosemary, but doesn't mean anything. I checked it against Fall River and the last names don't match. At the age of 12, James Bailey hires her as a dancer in his show. She was very talented. And at the age of 16, she marries Harry Wentworth. Rose claims that she was 14 when she married him, but told him she was 16. She was afraid that Harry wouldn't marry her. And Harry was sort of her protector. She did contortion, she did a little bit of aerial work, but eventually she became an equestrienne and the only lady turning somersaults. Lots of pictures of Rose. That's about the best we can do. This is from the Root Book, which is 1901, standing on the back of a horse. This is a Frederick Glazier was a photographer who went around and he photographed a lot of circus performers right on the lots. And this is this is 1905, by the way. If this is 1905, Rose in this picture is going to be what? 40 years old, right? She's 40 years old. She would stay with the Ringling Show a couple more years. She ends up in 1913 on the on the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show, where she retires. And there she is. This is a 1903 picture of Rose. And the New York Times article, which is the only article I could find, does a whole article on here. And again, she was called, of course, the English Rose. So she's from Fall River, but what her real name was, or her maiden name, we're still looking, however, and I got some help coming. So, okay, the circus in Fall River, again, we've been talking about people who came to Fall River, but here's some pictures actually taken in Fall River. These are all of the circus lots from the 19th century. This is where the circuses put up their tent. And if you plot these out on the map, what you notice that the earlier ones are all very close to downtown. But as time goes by, the city begins to build, and now you're starting to see them moving Rodman's Grove up on Rodman Street. Bedford Street east of the Merchants Mill. That's up in that area where just across the street from Columbus Park. 8 Rod Way, which is Plymouth Avenue and 2nd Street. 8 Rod Way near Rodman. The baseball grounds up on the corner of Bedford Street and Oak Grove Avenue. Eventually, 1889 is the first show I find at the Broadway circus grounds, Broadway show grounds, and it was a place where most of the circus in the 20th century would exhibit. But they still, you know, Stafford Road near the streetcar barn in 1893. There's one year Bonham goes to get out to take the lot down on Broadway, and the mill owners rent the land for that day so that people won't go to the circus. They said, too many people miss work, we lose production. So the people just went to wherever the circus was playing. They played up on off Plymouth Avenue that year. And again, when somebody stayed away from work in those days, they didn't get paid. There were no sick days in those days, and so they never got paid. But again, the circus was a big day. It was a big day for everybody. Big Berry, of course, is the old Fall River Stadium.
Yeah, where was that? On Pleasant Street?
Big Berry was, yes, it was it's where the police station is today, right, just in the back. There's a park there.
My mother always talked about Big Berry.
Right, Big Berry. Yeah, that's This is the Tom Mix Circus, and these are some pictures I picked up fairly recently. Now, there were a whole bunch of pictures taken in Fall River of the Tom Mix Circus. Somebody bought all the pictures with the mills in them, so obviously they were interested in the mill pictures, not interested in the circus pictures. Now, you notice the lot, it's tilted. It's what circus people call a gravity lot. You've got to be careful how you set your tent. The trapeze can't be like this, it's got to be flat. So they would have to set the tent, take an account for the so-called gravity, or with what the circus folk call the gravity lot. Here's Tom Mix himself. And when I was a kid, Tom Mix was a big thing, but the real Tom Mix was dead. He died in a car crash in 1939, driving about 100 miles an hour in his car that had the big horns on the front from the longhorn cattle. He did all of his own stunts. He made movies. His Wonder Horse Tony. And again, there was a radio show in those days, and the man who played Tom Mix was Curly Bradley, whoever Curly Bradley was. But in any case, as far as I was concerned, it was Tom Mix. Okay. This is the tent, I would guess is probably about a 300-foot tent. If you had to classify the show, we classify it as a medium-sized show. And this was a truck show. They went over the road in trucks. It was not a railroad circus. It was never that big, and he operated this from 37 to 39 till his death. This is the inside of a menagerie tent. And I remember going to see the Ringling Show in 1950 when I was in the 6th grade, and this was, you know, I was astounded. I mean, they had all kinds of animals that they carried over the road. They had 20 elephants, and when you paid your admission, you went into the menagerie tent first, then you went through a connection into the main tent. So they were still carrying menageries, and eventually, of course, they would do away with it because it's very expensive. This was taken in 1937, the Cole Brothers Circus. And this is down at the Watuppa Yard. These are the animal cars, and then these are the flat cars, and you notice that what they're doing is pulling these cars down along, and then off the end of the train. Right. And at the end of those cars, they just put up these inclined planes, and then they would roll the wagons down. This was in 37. This was the year I was, as a matter of fact, this was the day I was born. They were in Fall River, July 9th, 1937. Thank you. And again, we'll go back. This is the Tom Mix show, and again, they got the 4 main poles up here, but you see the mills, and somebody was interested primarily in the mills. Somehow they missed this one here. This is another circus set up down on the Broadway showgrounds. Here's the menagerie tent, here's the big top. So you went in here, you saw the animals, you went through the connection, saw the show in here. There would be a sideshow set up along the side. This is the Walter L. Main Circus. And then there would be what they would call grease joints, things that sold popcorn, cotton candy, no cotton candy in those days, but popcorn, lemonade, that sort of thing. And I like this picture because it shows the 3 cuts. What the train would come in, they would cut it into 3 sections. The cars for the animals, the baggage wagons, and of course there are a couple of private automobiles here, and then these would be the sleepers. This was the Cole Brothers show. It came in on a Sunday. They didn't show on the Sunday. They showed the next day on a Monday. Ken Maynard. You may remember the name Ken Maynard. He was America's favorite cowboy star, movie star. He was a movie star. A friend of mine went down to the runs, and Ken came out on his horse and fell off. He had a little bit too much to drink for lunch. He fell off the horse. And then this probably was taken before they made the cuts in this particular case. So the train would have quite a number of cars. The Cole show would be classified as a pretty good sized show, medium-sized circus. The Wild West shows. Wild West shows came into existence. Okay, next. With this gentleman here, Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody was a real cowboy, I guess you might say. He fought in the Civil War, he fought in the Indian Wars, he was an Indian scout. At 14, he rode for the Pony Express, of course, which is a rather short-lived way of delivering mail because the telegraph came and put him out of business almost immediately. He was a rather interesting character, drank a lot, but eventually would start what was called the Wild West show. And people were anxious to see. Everybody knew about Cody. One, he was an actor. He performed primarily in plays. It was before movie time. But also, he was the star of pulp fiction books. A man named Ned Buntline wrote a whole bunch of pulp fiction books, and he was the hero. And kids would read these books, and everybody wanted to see Buffalo Bill. Okay. And you can skip over that one too. This actually is part of a film. You notice, by the way, this was done in an outdoor arena. There was a side wall. You couldn't use a full-size tent simply because when you start firing bullets, you're going to put holes in the tent. So they wouldn't last very long. So actually this was a video, but we were having trouble playing videos now. So in any case, but this was Buffalo Bill over here. Okay. And of course, another character we find, not a character, but in this particular case, is not a human being, but Jumbo. And the Jumbo trade cards. Stephanie put this in because she thought we had a Cure Mill here in the city, and Cure Mill's advertising cards had Jumbo on it. Jumbo was everywhere. There was a Jumbo craze. By the time Bonham got Jumbo from London to the United States, everybody knew about Jumbo. Everybody wanted to see Jumbo. He created such a tremendous desire for people to go see this very, very large elephant. Okay, next. And here's Jumbo, by the way. This picture was at winter quarters. The fellow here, right here, is his handler. But look at the size of this elephant. He's 11 feet tall at the shoulder. 11 feet tall at the shoulder. And of course, Bonham thought he got a bargain, but actually the London Zoo got rid of him because the elephant was beginning to give them some trouble, and he was very large, and the kids used to ride on his back, and they decided that maybe he was a male elephant. Maybe it was not a good idea, so they sold him off to Bonham.
Is that what I think it is?
Yes, it's what you think it is, right. And again, here's his poster. You notice Jumbo is bigger than real life, and he could never carry that many people on his back, but it didn't make any difference. Exaggeration is the name of the game here. Now, Jumbo comes to Fall River in 1882, comes back in 1883, comes back in 1885. And by the way, the first time he came, the show lot was down near the Sagamore Mills. The demand for transportation was so great that the trolleys couldn't carry everyone, so people walked the length of the city down to the north end to see Jumbo. And about 25,000 people took in the show that time. That was probably about a quarter of Fall River's population. Now, as I said, he comes back. This is 1885, he's dead, but he does come back one more time. And there he is. Bonham, not to be, he's lost a big attraction here, but it's not a complete loss, because what happened was, supposedly, Jumbo was walking with a pygmy elephant, and Bonham sort of made up a little story that when they were up in Canada, as they were walking along the tracks, an unscheduled freight train came by. What actually happened was Jumbo would not move and got in the way. They tried to have him go down an embankment. He wouldn't go, got hit by the train. But Bonham had him saving the little elephant. He pushed him aside and sacrificed himself, you see. So he called Ward Scientific in Rochester, New York. And he said, "What can you do for me?" So what they did was they simply took the hide off the elephant. And by the way, as they're stuffing the hide, Ward sends a telegram to Bonham, and he says to Bonham, he says, you know, he's getting bigger than real life. Bonham said, "Just keep stuffing," he says, okay? That doesn't make any difference. And so this is how they exhibited him for a couple of years. And of course, once you couldn't see the real thing, they lost interest and they got something else. What is rather interesting here is that the skeleton is at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. It's not being exhibited. I saw it the last time that it was maybe 15 years ago. The hide went to Tufts University. They called it Jumbo. Bonham was on the board of directors. He gave him the hide. And what happened was that college students used to go and put pennies in Jumbo's trunk for good luck during exam time. Well, what happened was they had a fire at the museum, and all that was left of the hide was really ashes. That was it. But they are putting in a bronze Jumbo out in front of the museum. So they're going to kind of bring him back. Unfortunately, instead of bringing him back as he looked, they just took a generic elephant. And Bonham was more, Jumbo was more than just a generic elephant. He was really a special elephant. Okay. Again, something I remember, this is the Bonham and Bailey show. Of course, Ringling Brothers, Bonham and Bailey is probably taken in the 50s. They had these specs that went around. Reminds me of when I saw the show back in 1950. And what they did later on is they got, you notice the canvas is blue. What they wanted to do, they started to get into a little more production. And what they wanted to do is use spotlights and things. And so what they did was, you notice how bright it was in that last picture? So what they did was they got these blue tents, which did not let the light penetrate through. And now they could use spotlights and light the show to a better advantage. What's happening here again is that the colors in the slide are beginning to break down because it's very old. And what they're doing here, they're in the process of putting up this tent. They simply go around, pull on these, to tighten the sidewall over here and then tie them down. And sort of in conclusion, does the circus come to town anymore? It hadn't been here in a while. Last year, we finally got a circus in Fall River. And they played down at Father Travasso's field. And then what did they do is now they're repairing the field and not going to let anybody go on it anymore. There really is no place to put a circus in. The Cole show that used to come in, Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers played a number of different places. They played at where the old board mill was. And there was so much granite underneath that they had to hire somebody to come with a jackhammer to put holes in the granite so they could put the stakes in for the tent. Another time they played the airport, which wasn't very good. That land has all been used up now. This was down by Tillotson under the Braga Bridge, Borden Remington. There's a nice little park in here now, okay? Green grass, and notice hand of the geese walking around. But the circus, in order to dress it up, they fill the rings with sawdust. And this was all that was left when I went down the next day. And I had a priest friend of mine who was the circus chaplain, and he was an ex-La Salette father. And he said when he was a kid, he would go down every day at the day after the circus left, and he said all that would be left would be the images of the three rings, and he said, I would sit on a rock and cry. And he said, but they always came back. And Father Jack eventually, after he retired from the La Salette, became the circus priest, ran the circus ministry, and he had a great 10 or 15 years of retirement and doing exactly what he wanted to do. So that pretty much finishes up talking about the circus in Fall River. Again, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain them. If you want to stay around for a minute and talk later on, I'm more than happy to do that as well.
In the letter that we read, the copy of the letter,
Yeah.
you mentioned the Josephine Baker.
Yeah.
Is that like the famous Josephine Baker?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. That was a kid?
That was just a kid, right? Just a kid.
Oh, did you call her?
Yes.
In the late 70s, early 80s, my husband was very active in the JCs in Fall River, and one of the community services they did was when the circus came to Fall River up at the airport, all right, we got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and helped raise the tent. So, yeah, and it was a fantastic experience.
Yeah, as I said, they did play the airport. They didn't do much business there, but they did play there. And a lot, today's circuses work primarily with sponsors. That's really the only way. In the old days, these were all cold dates. By cold date, I meant no sponsor. They came in, and now if you sponsor the show, you have certain obligations. The show has certain obligations. But things have changed considerably. As I said, it went from a single ring to a 3-ring, back to a single ring, in some cases, no rings. Went to Montreal this weekend. I saw 2 circuses. Nobody left early. They gave standing ovations, and they called the cast back 3 times. They would have called them back more, but they just put the lights up because they'd be still standing there calling the people back. Different type of experience, people who understand the art form. And it's really a European art form. In Fall River, half the people leave. They think they're in church. They want to get out early, get to their car, beat everybody out. And so if you spend $75 for a ticket to go see a circus, and you can if you're buying, go to Cirque du Soleil, why leave early? You spent $75. You might as well get your money's worth. But it's just a different experience. Yes?
This is a question. I've always, when I was a younger kid, I used to hear this myth that circuses tended to hire people who were Roma immigrants or of Roma descent. Is that one of those like loaded stereotypes that emerge?
It is to a point, not exclusive. There are a lot of shows in Europe essentially have the Romani. I mean, this is what they do. They have their own circus. Everybody in the show is Romani, you know, gypsies, in other words, and they perform. That's how they make their living. But as far as America is concerned, and even the shows in Europe now, big thing now is circus schools and youth circuses. There are 1 million kids in Europe going to circus schools. And they don't call about going to the circus, they talk about doing circus. And we went to the circus school in Montreal, and you get a degree in performing. And it's a lot of people flunk out simply because if you like doing this, I watched the girl 5 or 6 times in a row just practice getting onto a trapeze and getting on gracefully, and then she would just do that again, and again. So it's a completely different experience when you get to Europe, and where you get to even in Montreal, which is really fantastic and different. Any other questions?
Yes, I remember the Barnum and Bailey Circus. I was 7 years old at the Broadway showgrounds.
Right.
Where the Save-A-Lot is today.
Yeah.
And I remember the sideshow and the 3 rings. And I also did it for 15 years with Cole Brothers. And I had the unfortunate incident of having my ticket stolen. So I just went and put more chairs up, and more pieces of wood, and I got another ticket. So I did this for 15 years. I just wanted to share this with the audience.
Which is what they always hired kids primarily, not the water elephants, by the way, because you got to give them water in a barrel, not a bucket. You'd be 500 buckets by the time you were done. But they would hire kids to put the seats in. And again, it's put the boards down and set up all of the chairs. And so that's what they would do. And of course, you got paid with the ticket.
Well, I shoveled poop.
Well, yeah.
So I know where you're coming from there.
Yeah. And again,
That was never ending.
that was the other end, not the right. But in any case, yeah, it's true, and it's as I said, there are shows around the shows now. About a dozen tented circuses. Ringling still operates 3 circuses. 2 of them are on about. Their trains are a mile long. But of course, when they go into they now stay for about a week. When they go into a stand, it's all in buildings, it's all production. It's just a completely different thing.
I'm not sure if you know, but last time I bought postage stamps, they were all circus stamps. They really.
Oh yeah, I think I have about 10 sheets of them. Okay. Well, very well. Yes.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, I worked in Bound Brook, New Jersey. And it was proudly the home of William Henry Johnson.
It was.
Zip the what is it?
Zip the what is it? So there you go. And he lives on. We'll let you live on. That's the thing. And poor old Zip, again, he lives on.
The urban legend in Bound Brook is that he was actually, I mean, I'm sure this isn't true, but it was actually, he was mentally a genius. And that his last
Yeah,
words
nothing I've read said he was a
right,
genius.
his
But
last words on his deathbed was, well, we certainly fooled them.
well, I wish he was. I hope that's correct, because that would be fun. That's just right in line with everything. I think. By the way, we're rather interesting. In one year, when the Bonham Show comes, a guy named used to have the unrideable mule, and of course, what happened was the mule would go pretty fast, and then the mule was trained on cue to stop, because he would stop and you would keep going. And over you would go. Of course, if you could ride the mule, you got a special prize on it. Some guy named Tommy Tucker. That sounds like a fake name, but Tom Tucker rode the unrideable mule and won $2.50, which probably was a week's pay back in the 1890s. And so that wasn't too bad. Again, hey, thank you for coming. It's been